Having looked at the key self-dealing or fiduciary duty and due care and diligence, we need to consider that there are a lot of other things that directors and officers have to do. Of course, to be comprehensive would be a course, probably even a year-long study in and of itself about the various laws that apply to different kinds of companies. So rather than do that, I think it's best just to think about the thing you should do if you're a director and officer. And that's to get an understanding of the various acts or statutes that may apply to you. And so this particular slide here is just letting us know that there's lots of different acts that put requirements on directors and officers, and having an understanding of the relevant law that applies to you is really important to the role. Some of the core areas, or not even core, but most important things that you need to think about in terms of other duties are insolvent trading, and we're going to do that in Module 4. We're going to look, we actually don't look at continuous disclosure, but that's a very important requirement if you're a listed entity, so that'd be something you'd need to be aware of. There's requirements around related party transactions. That's really coming close to dealing with that self-dealing issue, how to deal with transactions between parties where you may be conflicted. And again, the self-dealing element comes out in terms of disclosing directors' interests. Really importantly, there's legislation that applies quite broadly across most companies, like occupational health and safety or work health and safety, and privacy legislation. All of these have requirements on directors and officers, so you should be aware of those specific pieces of legislation and their impact. And if you're a non-profit, right, the ACNC now covers a lot of the governance requirements. The core areas that they look at are the same as what we've dealt with, so hopefully that gets you there, but you will need to understand the specific requirements of the ACNC. So perhaps the only area that's worth clarifying is what the directors actually need to do, particularly directors and officers to some degree, because we've covered this idea of fiduciary care and the fiduciary duty or self-dealing and due care and diligence, and it makes it seem like directors have to do everything. And that's actually not the case. So the next couple of slides, we're going to deal with this issue of delegation, what you can and can't do. So directors can delegate their particular powers that they have, or the execution of the role. And that delegation, though, does need to conform with a couple of requirements. So the first thing that needs to happen is you must believe that the person is going to act in accordance with the laws. So if you know someone is going to do something illegal, well, you can't delegate to them. That hopefully is pretty obvious. The second thing is that you must believe that they're competent and reliable. Okay, so once someone shows you a sign of not being able to do the job or not being reliable, then you run into a problem if you delegate to them. Okay, so this means good HR practices need to be in place at the top of the organisation. When you appoint someone, you need to make sure you do the really good reference checking, and the appointment process confirms that they can do the task at a very high level if you're appointing officers that you delegate to. The second thing is you need this ongoing monitoring. So if you start to see that reporting isn't appropriate or is not timely or is incomplete, they become red flags to you as a director. And if so, sometime in the distance, a judge may think that you should have acted earlier and that maybe you should have taken some of that delegation back. Really importantly, it doesn't excuse you due care and diligence. Okay, so what does that mean? Okay, so there's one situation where the law says, right, that directors must. Now, if the law says directors must, you must bring an independent mind. Yes, you can delegate some of the detailed work, but you've got to consider that work and you've got to look at it. So one of the problems in the Centro case was that with the financial reports, many of the directors said that they didn't even read them before they approved them. In that way, they hadn't carried out care and diligence. They hadn't reviewed what had been given them. So you need to bring an independent mind to things. Also, not only where the law says, but I think in terms of major decisions, right? You really do need to make sure for the same reason that you bring your mind to it. You can't totally abdicate or delegate your role as a director. The less or the lower in importance a decision, right, the less there's a risk that you've inappropriately delegated. And again, the idea here is that you only need to have an inquisitive mind about what's given to you. You don't actually need to do the work per se. So section 198 and 190 give us this ability to delegate. They've got to be competent, qualified to give advice, okay, or carry out the work. And you've got to think to yourself, is there any reason that they shouldn't be doing the work? So that brings us to the end of the individual director's duties. We've realised that we can't self-deal. We've got to take that fiduciary responsibility seriously. We've got to act with care and diligence, and that there's a raft of other things that we need to take into account. We do, however, as directors, have an ability to delegate to the executive, but under certain conditions. We've got to make sure we can delegate it, and we've got to be sure that the person who we delegate to is going to be reliable and competent and act appropriately. Okay, all of that is focused on what the individual does. Why don't we move now from what each individual director needs to be able to do and think about what the board as a whole, what the role of the board actually is.